And we're recording.
All
Shall I go ahead and start then?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, welcome to the keynote address. Today we're going to hear from James Woodbridge, a paper that is co-written with Bradley Armour-Garb. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce both of them. Bradley Armour-Garb is professor and chair of philosophy at SUNY Albany. His research areas include philosophy of language, metaphysics, philosophical logic, and the philosophy of logic. His books include Deflationism and Paradox, Deflationary Truth, both edited with J.C. Beale, The Law of Non-Contradiction, co-edited with J.C. Beale and Graham Priest, Pretense and Pathology with James Woodbridge, Reflections on the Liar, Fictionalism and Philosophy, co-edited with Fred Kroon, and Deflationary Approaches to Truth, a Guide with James Woodbridge, which will be published through OUP in 2022. Also with Fred Kroon, he's a series editor for the Logic and Philosophy Element series on Cambridge University Press. Much of his work has regarded truth and paradox. Okay, and then we'll hear today from James Woodbridge, he'll be the presenter, is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His research areas include philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophical logic. His paper, Truth as a Pretense, presented one of the earliest versions of alethic fictionalism. In collaboration with Bradley Armour-Garb, he has further developed this fictionalist approach and applied it to dissolving the liar paradox and other apparent semantic pathology across publications in Noose, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, Analysis, Philosophical Studies, and Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Woodbridge and Armour-Garb unified and extended this work in their first book, Pretense and Pathology, Philosophical Fictionalism and Its Applications, on Cambridge University Press in 2015. Their forthcoming second book, Deflationary Approaches to Truth, a Guide on Oxford University Press, will be published in 2022. All right, so without further ado, Professor Woodbridge.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk. Interestingly, I presented Truth as a Pretense way back in 2002 at the Mountain Plains Philosophy Conference here in Las Vegas. It was my first trip to Las Vegas, and then I ended up several years later being employed here. Longer ago than perhaps any of us care to remember, but you know, there it is. All right, so this talk is on fictionalism. And fictionalism has become a recognized, if not popular, approach within philosophical theorizing over the past 40 years. Various philosophers have proposed versions of mathematical fictionalism, modal fictionalism, moral fictionalism, alethic fictionalism. The AGW there is Armour-Garb and me. Fictionalism about attitude description and propositions. Fictionalism about existence talk or identity talk, and fictionalism about fictional characters. The tricky thing about the rise in fictionalist theories, though, is that in the literature, there hasn't been really sufficient care or clarity about a lot of the central ideas, and in particular about how fiction is implemented in fictionalism. We're going to talk about a couple of ways of understanding this and thump for our preferred way of incorporating fiction into your theorizing and developing a fictionalist account. So I'll start by talking about just some requirements and observations about the connection between fictionalism and fiction. The first point might seem fairly obvious or fairly intuitive, but it's sort of surprising that sometimes people don't really take this into account, is that if you're going to offer a fictionalist account, your account has to make some appeal to fiction. And I mean, if you're not bringing fiction into your theorizing, it would seem odd to call your account a fictionalist account. Now, this excludes from the classification one approach that used to get heralded as like one of the original fictionalist ideas, which was Bas van Frassen's constructive empiricism in philosophy of science. But I think that's fine to exclude that because it's not a fictionalist account. And actually, right early in the book, von Frossen criticizes fictionalism as a bad approach in philosophy of science. So I really think if your account isn't making an appeal to fiction, you shouldn't really call it a fictionalist account. Another thing to note is that fiction is a category or status of discourse or representation more broadly. So a fictionalist account about some subject is really an account of discourse about that subject. So if you want to kind of take the probably most familiar way of drawing this distinction, a moral fictionalism is not a normative ethical theory. It's a meta-ethical theory because it's a theory about moral language. It's not a theory about morality per se. So one of the main points that we're stressing here is that fictionalism is an account of discourse, which means it is an approach in philosophy of language. And we'll come back to that in a little bit further down. Regarding fiction, fiction is about, or as we'll say, portrays something that's made up, right? Or so, and so not real. This can vary to a certain extent between what we might call pure fiction and historical fiction. So it's not sort of an all or nothing kind of thing, but the word fictional applies to what does the portraying in any case, the discourse, not to anything the discourse putatively connects to. So as Conan Doyle is writing the Holmes stories, to belabor that old chestnut once again, talks about London. His discourse about London ends up being fictional discourse about London. And some people want to say it's not even about real London. It's about some sort of not real London. I think it's probably about real London. But still, it's fictional because the discourse is fictional discourse. And then the last sort of thing that ends up being important for us in a lot of ways is that fiction or fictional discourse is, as we like to say, semantically infelicitous if it's taken at face value. We're going to talk a lot in terms of this idea of taking claims at face value. We're going to use that terminology rather than talking about taking claims literally, because the idea of literal versus non-literal has certain baggage and presuppositions that we want to try to avoid. It brings in kind of a level of confusion. We have a way of understanding the idea that something is literal, and it involves taking a claim on a face value reading. But it sort of involves more than that, and then other people want to say other things about the idea of literalness that we're not necessarily in agreement with. So, in looking at some aspects of fiction too, we can sort of split up what we call fictional discourse into three different categories. There are what are typically called the fictive sentences, and these are sentences that are taken from a work of fiction. If we're kind of taking literary fiction as our paradigm, I'm not restricting the idea of fiction to literary fiction, but it's the sort of most familiar. So we have a sentence, Harry Potter was snoring loudly, and that's taken from the book Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince in chapter 3. So it's one of the sentences that's right there in the work. We also have what we can call metafictive sentences, which are sentences about what a work of fiction portrays. Now, sometimes a sentence will appear in the work itself, and when it's employed in the work by the author, then it's a fictive sentence. But even if I take that sentence out and I talk about the work now, not as the author, but saying something that pertains to the story, I am issuing a metafictive sentence, not a fictive one, even though like syntactically it's the same sentence. The role that it's playing is doing something else. So metafictive sentences can be sort of directly parallel to fictive sentences, but they're doing something different. So we can characterize what the work portrays with a sentence. So we have Harry Potter is an only child, sentence 2. And then sentences that follow from that can also be used as metafictive claims that have to do with what's going on in the story, even if they don't appear in the story. I don't think the stories, the Harry Potter stories, ever say Harry Potter is a human being, but that follows from everything that's going on in the story. So it's a way to characterize something about the story, not in the production of the story, but in talking about it from the outside in this metafictive discourse. Then there are what are called transfictive, or some philosophers of fiction call it external metafictive sentences. And these are sentences that are not from the story and they're not about what goes on in the story. But we say things like, Harry Potter is a fictional character. That is a fiction-related sentence. He's not a fictional character according to the story, right? And it's not something that the story says about him, and it's not something that I would say to characterize what goes on in the story, but it still has to do with the work as a work of fiction from this external metafictive position, or as for a shorter phrase, transfictive. Or we say things like Harry Potter was created by J.K. Rowling. Again, it's not part of the story that he was created. According to the story, he's created by his parents. But as we stand outside the story and talk about the story as a work of fiction, we might say something like Harry Potter was created by J.K. Rowling. So we have these different kinds of fictional discourse. Now, when we talk about understanding fictional discourse, that might initially sound like what we're trying to do is understand just the fictive sentences. When an author creates a work of fiction, how are we to understand what the author is doing and the sentences that the author produces? How should we analyze them semantically, pragmatically, and so on? But when we want to relate fiction to fictionalism, we need a broader sort of approach, a more inclusive approach that really covers metafictive and transfictive discourse as well, and thus understanding fictional discourse is really part of a philosophy of fiction more broadly. So here we want to sort of think primarily of people who work on philosophy of fiction, like Searle or Walton, and then only secondarily of somebody like Lewis, who comes up with an account of metafictive sentences and possibly transfictive sentences, but not really of fictive sentences. He actually explicitly sets that aside. So he's not offering a full-blown philosophy of fiction. He's just giving us an account of what we're doing and how to understand the semantics of our sentences when we talk about fiction, and trying to give an account of how our talk about works of fiction can be true. So it's really people like Searle and Walton that we're thinking about when we're trying to understand fictional discourse in this broader, more inclusive sort of sense. So philosophy of fiction is that kind of project, understanding fictive discourse as well as metafictive, as well as transfictive, and so on. But it's really important to keep clear the distinction between philosophy of fiction and fictionalism. Right? Fictionalism is going to involve something else, like thinking about fiction in a different sort of way, not giving an account of fiction. If you don't clearly distinguish these two sorts of projects or what one is doing, you can end up mistaking results from work done in one area, for instance, philosophy of fiction, as automatically applicable to or extending into another, developing a fictionalist account. And we'll see this sort of problem arise later on as we consider the way certain people have attempted to develop a fictionalist account. They kind of, the way they're relating developing a fictional account to philosophy of fiction is tying it too tightly and is sort of making it too dependent, and that's going to create various problems. It can also end up framing and pursuing misguided investigations, or what Brad and I think are misguided investigations. For instance, is whether some theory of literary fictions, as the quote says, will prove canonical for minimally adequate accounts of other kinds of fictions: mathematical, scientific, legal, ethical, metaphysical, and epistemological. And this is from a paper by Woods and Rosales from 2010 in an anthology that they put together. This ignores obvious differences between literary works and other sorts of subjects listed. I don't know that I want to necessarily map an account of literary fiction onto, say, an epistemological fictionalism or a mathematical fictionalism. That would seem sort of odd. It also slides from the idea of works of fiction as they occur in literature to fictional entities. And part of what we're saying when we're telling people to focus on the idea that fictionalism is about discourse is that the whole phrase fictional entities is a category mistake, right? Entities aren't fictional or non-fictional. Names or phrases purporting to denote entities can be fictional names and therefore not denote anything if you're not a fictional realist, if you're a fictional anti-realist, or maybe denote something if you're a fictional realist, but it's the name or the denoting expression that's going to be fictional, not an entity. That's an elision that creates a confusion. And this ends up undermining the plausibility of fictionalism in general. If you're trying to say, if you're forcing modeling your mathematical or your scientific fictionalism, fictionalist account on some work of literary fiction, you might be being accused of saying that, you know, science is just literature or mathematics is just literature. And those are frankly bad accounts of mathematics and science. So you don't want to be offering that sort of account. So if being a fictionalist with regard to science, say maybe with regard to discourse about unobservable objects, you could end up just making fictionalism implausible. And to the extent that this keeps happening, people might say, look, this whole fictionalist approach just seems silly and inappropriate in like across the board for anywhere but works of fiction. So that would seem like a bad strategy for somebody who's trying to develop something within this sort of approach. So the question is, how do we relate fiction to fictionalism? And I'm going to start by talking about what's probably been the most common way of doing this. It was sort of historically the first way of doing it. And that's to appeal to fiction in a comparative manner. That is for the purposes of analogizing how one is treating or is proposing to treat the target of one's theorizing. Theorists often indicate that this is what they're up to when they offer a typically vague instruction, right, to treat the target of theorizing as a kind of fiction, right? And then they just kind of leave it as that. So this proposed treatment is not, doesn't necessarily explicitly mention the notion of fiction at all in its details. Somebody might actually offer an account that sort of treats something like it's a work of fiction, but never says, you know, hey, what I'm doing is treating this like a work of fiction. They're just sort of doing it, and they might be having that in mind, but their account doesn't bring the notion of fiction in explaining what's going on with their subject of theorizing, with their target of theorizing. So that would then sort of violate that first requirement regarding a fictionalist account. So one of the problems with comparative fictionalism is that it's a way to, in a sense, say somebody's developing a fictionalist account when there isn't really much reason to say so. And I think this is sort of what was going on with the earlier classifications of like von Frassen's account as fictionalism. He wasn't comparing anything to fiction, but then when people looked at his view, they thought, oh, well, what he's kind of doing is treating science like a kind of fiction. But I don't really know that that's a good account of what von Frassen was doing. He says certain things about science that one might also say about fiction, but we'll see later on in discussing some of the problems that come up for comparative fictionalism, further problems we'll see how those problems arise. So this comparative fictionalism, what it's trying to do is link the account that you're giving of some subject to the semantics of fictional discourse as a model for the target discourse. I mean, if you're going to do sort of more than treat it as a kind of fiction, that's basically what you're doing. You're saying, all right, I've got some discourse, I'm going to treat that like it's fictional discourse and then try to understand what's going on there. And since you're using it as an exemplar or in this analogizing or comparative manner, fiction remains external to the account that you're developing. It doesn't necessarily have to be right in the account that you're developing here. You could just be making this kind of analogizing comparison that maybe is illuminating about what you're doing, but potentially it's not. When people talk about Hartree-Field's 1980 work, Science Without Numbers, where he develops his nominalistic mathematics, his philosophy of mathematics, they talk about that also as an early work of fictionalism. But it's interesting that in that account, I mean, other than in the preface, in the core of the book, he doesn't talk about fiction at all. In the preface, he sort of mentions it to some degree, but it's actually not really until 1989 when he put together an anthology of papers that there he really brings out explicitly, look, a way to think about my project there is as a fictionalist account of mathematics. But in 1980, there was very little reason to call his view a fictionalist view. He doesn't use the notion of fictionalism. It's really external and remains external as he develops the account. So I want to talk about some concerns that arise when you try to do fictionalism in this external, comparative, analogizing, exemplar kind of way. So we started with this idea of what I'm going to call first level comparative fictionalism. So that notes similarities between something you're analyzing, a discourse you're analyzing, and works of fiction. But noticing similarities there and saying, oh, look, see how these things are similar? It's really only suggestive, and you don't get a lot of details about how to follow the vague instruction to treat something like a fiction. So it leads to misguided critiques and defense. Specifically, I've seen critiques of so-called first-level comparative fictionalist views of mathematics done in terms of like counting the number of similarities and dissimilarities between mathematical discourse and fictional discourse. And that just seems to be like a bean counting, who cares, to a large extent. So, you know, somebody's saying, gee, mathematics is a lot like fiction. And somebody else is saying, no, it's not. Here are the ways that it's different. And that's, you know, that seems like a sideshow that is better left alone. So if you're going to be comparative with regard to your relating fiction to fictionalism, it's better to do what Brad and I call second level comparative fictionalism, where you kind of you give some details about the vague instruction. You're not going to be comparing, say, the target of theorizing with fiction, but you're going to model your account of the target. So the claims from some fragment of discourse D, you're going to model your account of that fragment of discourse on an account of fiction or account of fictional discourse. And so you'll have some philosophy of fiction and its semantics for fictional discourse, and that will be providing you, in a sense, a template to develop your account of this other discourse, discourse D. So it gives you that a framework, it gives you some details, as we say here, puts meat on the bones, but there generates a particular question, right? Now you've got a philosophy of fiction on the table, and you've got a fragment of discourse you're giving an account to, and you're modeling it on that philosophy of fiction. So one way you might be doing that is by saying, I'm modeling it on this philosophy of fiction because I think it's correct about fiction. That's why I'm using this particular philosophy of fiction. Alternatively, somebody might be saying, I don't really care whether this is a correct philosophy of fiction. That's not what I'm interested in. All I'm interested in is that it's an account that has an interesting structure, gives an interesting analysis of some discourse. And now I'm going to parallel that in developing an account of this other discourse. But if it's the latter, I mean, if that's all you're doing, it's just an inroad to a certain sort of framework, then why call it a fictionalist account? You're modeling it on something that a theorist offered as a philosophy of fiction, but you don't really care whether it's really a philosophy, correct about fiction or not. That's not, that's not what's driving you. What's driving you is just the structure of the account. So then if that's what's going on, why call that sort of account? You're modeling it on some account, which is offered as an account of fiction, but you don't care whether it's correct about fiction or not. You just like the structure. So then why should you call your account fictionalist? So you're only going to get really second level comparative fictionalism if the philosophy of fiction you're using for your comparison, if you're taking that as correct about fiction. But this adds a number of problems that arise because you're, in a sense, that's your starting point. Here's a philosophy of fiction. I think it's right about fiction. Now I'm going to use it. So you have what we call the added burden problem, where the would-be fictionalist now has to establish the correctness of the particular philosophy of fiction, because there are lots of different philosophies of fiction. And so if you're going to say, I'm going to develop a fictionalist account of discourse D, I'm going to use this philosophy of fiction because it's correct about fiction, and that's why my account will end up being a fictionalist account, because it's modeled on the correct account about fiction. But that's an added burden that you have now of saying, well, this is the right, I'm modeling it on this philosophy of fiction because it's the right one. You also have a strange result that we call the exclusion problem, which is that if somebody is also pursuing a second level comparative fictionalism. They're trying to do that. And they're using a different philosophy of fiction from the one you're using. You have to say they're not developing a fictionalist account, right? You don't even get to just say they're trying to develop a fictionalist account, but they're doing it wrong. You're saying what they're doing doesn't even count as developing a fictionalist account because they're modeling it on something that's not right about fiction as far as you're concerned. And that seems like a rather strong sort of position to take regarding other routes of theorizing that people are trying to pursue a fictionalist approach. So that's an overly strong consequence of pursuing fictionalism via second level comparative fictionalism. We also have what we call the forced classification problem, which is the philosophy of fiction that you appeal to in your second level comparative fictionalist approach. That philosophy of fiction automatically counts as a fictionalist philosophy of fiction. Why? Well, because any account that is structured like this philosophy of fiction is about discourse is a fictionalist account. Well, you could hardly have an account that's more like this philosophy of fiction than this philosophy of fiction. So it's automatically a fictionalist account of fiction. And every other philosophy of fiction is automatically not a fictionalist account of fiction. But here's a bizarre result of that, right? That when people think about accounts of fiction, philosophies of fiction, they tend to think Walton's account and I guess also Lewis's account are fictionalist philosophies of fiction. Maybe not Lewis's, but Walton's certainly, and Everett's. They have these philosophies of fiction where they don't take fictional discourse to be about, or they don't denote anything. They don't have real reference or anything like that. So they're the fictionalist philosophies of fiction. And Thomason and Searle are typically considered to be the realist philosophies of fiction, right? They think works of fiction, in the creation of work of fiction, the author actually brings into existence these abstract objects, the fictional characters, and the fictional names then refer to these abstract objects. So they have reference. There's no reference failure, and so on. But now here's the odd sort of thing. If you're pursuing second level comparative fictionalism and you pick Thomason's realist, what we would normally call a realist philosophy of fiction, now all of a sudden Thomason's philosophy of fiction counts as a fictionalist philosophy of fiction. And Walton's account, since it's not an account structured like what you think is the correct structure of fiction, it's not a fictionalist account of fiction. It's not a fictionalist philosophy of fiction. That's a really counterintuitive result, right? But if you say the way to do fictionalism is through second level comparative fictionalism, you'll end up with that bizarre result of this forced classification problem. And then finally, you get what we think is another problem. We call it the order of priority problem, which is that you have to do philosophy of fiction first and then use the results in philosophy of fiction to provide a fictionalist account of anything. And that's going to, create a further obstacle again to distinguishing between fictionalist philosophies of fiction and non-fictionalist or realist philosophies of fiction in some kind of unforced and motivated way. So that's the, the forced classification problem I was talking about. The order of priority problem kind of undergirds the forced classification problem, and has this, leads to these unmotivated kind of bizarre results. So some problems here. Now, there are also some concerns with comparative fictionalism in application, as it's actually played out in the fictionalist literature. Again, it's typically mostly vague, treated as some kind of fiction, or compare it to some philosophy of fiction. And this has generated the following sorts of mistakes. To begin with, we get what we call overly metaphysical characteristics of fictionalism. So this goes back to that idea of fictional entities, right? And so the idea is we're going to treat certain putative entities as mere fictions or as useful fictions. And that's the way Putnam talked about fictionalism in 71. And what this does centrally is it confuses a metaphysical motivation, avoiding ontological commitment to weird objects. That's a motivation for fictionalism, but it confuses that motivation for the central definitive feature of this sort of approach. Another problem or sort of error in application that has come up are these overly epistemological characterizations of fictionalism. So this analogizes in terms of the epistemic status that fictive discourse gets in virtue of being fiction. And this was kind of the framing idea that Mark Calderon used both when he put together his anthology, inappropriately in our view, titled Fictionalism in Metaphysics, because there isn't fictionalism in metaphysics. It's not a metaphysical view. But even though he was calling it fictionalism in metaphysics, he thought it was really the criteria for fictionalism were epistemological. So the distinctive commitment of fictionalism is that acceptance in a given domain of inquiry need not be truth normed, and that acceptance of a sentence from the associated region of discourse need not involve belief in its content. So this understanding fictionalism this way, of course, is why von Frossen's constructive empiricism got labeled fictionalism, again, we think inappropriately. And what this is doing is it's confusing a consequence of adopting fictionalism about some fragment of discourse with the definitive feature of such an account. Sure, if you're taking the discourse, you're giving a fictionalist analysis of it, then you're probably not going to think that the distinctive commitment is belief in the content, at least not in the surface content. And you might not think that the discourse is truth normed, although that potentially also is misleading. We might want the discourse still to be truth normed, even on a fictionalist account. So we might want to try to figure out if that's possible to do. So this then also makes fictionalism the target of criticisms that don't really apply to fictionalism, but really only to some versions of it, right? The versions that rule out the possibility that sentences from the discourse could be true, right? It's only gonna, there will be criticisms that can be launched at what we'll call error theoretic fictionalism, or ETF. So the idea that when you give a fictionalist account, you're in a sense producing an error theory of the face value reading of the claims. They're all false on a face value reading, but when we understand the fictionalism involved, then maybe they're not false or they come out as true or something like that. But then somebody might say, oh, I have these problems with taking this to be an error theory. And since all fictionalism generates error theory, fictionalism just doesn't work. It doesn't work here. And the point is that's only going to work for error theoretic fictionalism. And there are other ways, better ways to develop fictionalist accounts. So among sorts of slightly better ways are pragmatics-based characterizations of fictionalism. So here we see people saying that the sentences from a discourse are not asserted as true, but they're only quasi-asserted, or there's this different speech act that we're performing. This is properly focused on discourse, but again, it's still confusing a consequence of developing a fictionalist account for a definitive feature. And also, it's a consequence, again, only of some versions of fictionalism. It's not an automatic consequence of every version of fictionalism. There will be versions of fictionalism, types of fictionalist accounts that allow you to say you're making a genuine assertion and what you're asserting is actually true. So really what we need to be getting at more are semantic issues. That's where the fiction and fictionalism are going to be making kind of intersection, not so much in the second level comparative fictionalist way, but in a more, in a kind of a broader and more integrated sort of way at the same time. So the overly simple semantic version is what I mentioned before. It's the error theoretic fictionalist view, or the claim that all sentences from the discourse are false. Right? So we start off with an error theory, and then somebody might say, hey, since they're all false on a face value reading, let's not give them a face value reading, let's give them a fictionalist reading. Sometimes people sort of took Mackey's error theory about moral discourse and said, oh, Mackey's offering a fictionalism. And the point is, well, no, he's not. He's offering an error theory. You might then go on to say, so let's like be fictionalist about this. But, you know, just because it's an error theory doesn't mean it's automatically fictionalist, because not all fictionalist accounts are going to be error theories. So a more refined version is that all sentences from the discourse are literally false. Again, literally ends up being a loaded word. So I like to say false on a face value reading. And that's at least allowing that you could say the face value reading, it doesn't tell you what's going on with this claim. There's stuff working in the background, and so it turns out it's not false. Maybe it's not even false as standardly used. It's only false on a face value reading, but that's because a face value reading isn't really the standard way of interpreting the sentence. So this is the most inclusive version, right, of a semantic characterization, is to say, if sentences from the discourse were given a face value reading, again, which is not to say they're standard reading, they would turn out to be semantically infelicitous. There'd be something wrong with them, typically because the names employed end up not denoting anything. And we take the last inclusive characterization to state a necessary but not sufficient condition for an account of some fragment of discourse, D, to be a fictionalist account. So if you're saying I'm offering a fictionalist account, what you're doing to start is you're saying there's this fragment of discourse, D, and I think that if we try to give a face value reading of the sentences, they're going to turn out to be semantically infelicitous. But what I want to do is explain why the discourse is useful and we can communicate with it even so. And so I'm going to give an account according to which in a sense, at least the proper reading of the sentence is not the face value reading, even if what I'm calling the proper reading isn't yet the standard reading. There's at least a proposal that it should be, and that would be a way to salvage the discourse and understand how it's useful. So if somebody's, you know, a fictionalist about propositions, or they don't think there are propositions, and they develop a fictionalist account of folk psychological discourse, that's been happening a lot lately. People have been developing what they're calling mental fictionalism. In a sense, what they're saying are, you know, belief ascriptions if you take them at face value, if you take the that clause to be a referential expression and the belief, the word belief to express a relation between a thinker and this whatever's picked out by that referential expression, some abstract object, then the discourse is going to turn out to be semantically infelicitous because there aren't any of those objects. But that doesn't mean folk psychological discourse is garbage. It doesn't mean that it's always false, right? We're going to reinterpret what's going on here, understand the discourse in a way that will allow it to allow us to understand it as useful. So, main takeaway: while fictionalism is often motivated by considerations from metaphysics or epistemology, fictionalism is exclusively, it's an approach in philosophy of language, and it has to do largely with a semantic understanding of a discourse you're analyzing. So, where is the fiction in fictionalism? Brad and I have a different kind of classification for a more recent way of developing fictionalist accounts that we prefer, and it's called philosophical fictionalism. And here the idea is you're going to make explicit use of some notion of fiction, but it's right in the account's details of the discourse you're theorizing about. So rather than like appealing to it for analogy purposes, it's part of the explanation. It's integrated in explaining the semantic mechanisms at work in the discourse you're analyzing. So it makes fiction internal to the account rather than something external that you're just using for comparative purposes. So philosophical fictionalism is to fiction the way philosophical logic is to logic. If you think of something in philosophical logic, you might use machinery or techniques from logic in developing an account of something else. And that might be a way to do some philosophical logic. And so you're giving an analysis, a kind of logical analysis of something other than logic using this logical machinery. Maybe an example, like maybe we could think of quantification over possible worlds as doing something like this. Hey, let's treat our modal discourse quantificationally in terms of quantification over worlds. So that means that philosophical fictionalism is to philosophy of fiction the way as philosophical logic is to philosophy of logic, right? They aren't dependent so much on one another. Philosophical fictionalism thus avoids those problems that confront comparative fictionalism, right? All of those sorts of added burden problem and exclusion problem and things like that. So the general aspects of philosophical fictionalism is that, following again our first point, it's an account offered is an analysis of some fragment of discourse, D. Then the second point that sort of emerged, the necessary semantic condition, is to note that if one were to give the sentences from D a face value reading, they would be semantically infelicitous. Then what happens is that the semantic mechanisms of the discourse involve a kind of redirection away from what a face value reading of the sentence would yield. So what it says or the content of the claim is not what it looks like it says on the surface. There's a semantic redirection. And finally, the redirection is implemented by mechanisms that apply some notion of fiction. And we think these four conditions are all necessary conditions for an account to qualify as what we call a philosophical fictionalist account. We also think that they're jointly sufficient, but I haven't really kind of dug too much into that, but it seems like it's jointly sufficient to me. The last one is important because if you don't have this last number 4 condition here, you'll end up with a kind of explosion of what counts as a fictionalist account, a philosophical fictionalist account. What happens would be that, expressivism in ethics would count as fictionalism, or phenomenalism about medium-sized dry goods, about ordinary objects, would count as fictionalism. Even like Russell's no class theory of classes would count as fictionalism, but none of those employ the notion of fiction, and there might be a kind of semantic redirection from a face value reading of the claim and so forth, but it's not implemented through a mechanism that actually applies the notion of fiction. So the idea isn't that there's something about fiction that's redirecting, that's doing the redirection here. That's what makes the account fictionalist. So going back to philosophy of fiction, philosophical fictionalist philosophies of fiction would be employing the notion of fiction in an account of mechanisms that do a semantic redirection away from a face value reading of the sentence. So if we look at sentence 2 from way above, the sentence, Harry Potter is an only child, David Lewis said, look, the way to understand what's going on here is by employing the idea of a story prefix. And so that will give you the semantics of this claim. So 2, Harry Potter is an only child, is just an elision of a prefixed claim that says, according to the Harry Potter stories, Harry Potter is an only child. So you get this prefix that latches onto the claim. And since the prefix involves a notion of fiction, right? A story, a fictional story, that then makes this a philosophical fictionalist account of that fictive discourse. Walton's approach to this is more complicated, but its complications actually allow it a greater kind of flexibility that I'll mention in a bit. So Walton talks about games of make-believe, and he's using that to analyze representation in the arts in general. But when it comes to talking about fiction, he thinks that the games of make-believe will make a claim like 2, a pretense involving a make-believe involving way of really putting forward this serious content labeled as 2-star here, right? And it's that the Harry Potter stories are such that one who engages in a pretense of kind K in a game authorized for them, for these stories, makes it to be pretended of himself that in the game that he speaks truly when uttering 2. So that's an overly complicated way of saying the stories portray there being someone named Harry Potter who is an only child. And so Walton's account here, like Lewis's, makes 2, Harry Potter is an only child, really a claim not about Harry Potter, but about the Harry Potter stories and what they portray. So that these 2 accounts end up in the same place with regard to fiction, but only with regard to fiction. So contrast this with, again, the so-called realist philosophies of fiction from Searle, Kripke, and Thomason. They don't think Harry Potter as an only child involves fiction. It's not really it now turns out to be true because there's this abstract object that got created in the writing of the story. So they're not giving fictionalist accounts of claim 2. They give a kind of realist, abstract object realist account of it. So second level comparative fictionalism as an approach will turn into philosophical fictionalism, but if and only if the semantics from the philosophy of fiction on which a theorist models her account of some discourse, D, is part of a philosophical fictionalist philosophy of fiction. But given that, you know, that's where you end up if you do second level comparative fictionalism, you can just avoid all of the other problems that come with thinking of fictionalism as a second level comparative fictionalist does, by just being a philosophical fictionalist and just saying, look, here's some discourse. I'm going to analyze what's going on in this discourse by explaining the semantics in such a way where I think the content the claims put forward isn't the surface content, what you'd get on a face value reading, but it's redirected to some other content. And what's doing the redirection is some mechanism that involves fiction. So if you think about second level comparative fictionalist accounts, there are some in the literature. Otavio Bueno has an account of mathematics, and it's based on Thomason's semantics for transfictive discourse. But this is not a philosophical fictionalist account. I mean, Otavio thinks that there are mathematical objects. They just get created as mathematicians do math, but then they are real abstract objects. Similarly, Schiffer's account of propositions is based on Searle's semantics for transfictive discourse. And again, it's taking Searle's idea that when you introduce a fictional name, you create an abstract object. And Schiffer thinks when, or at one point he thought, when we introduce sentences, we create these abstract objects, but then they're there. They're real abstract objects that exist. So it's a realism about propositions and a realism about mathematics, just in a kind of activity created, mind created sort of way. But now Rosen's account of modal discourse, of possible worlds talk, based on Lewis's account of metafictive discourse, that idea of a prefix, that is a philosophical fictionalist account of modal discourse. And Walton's own account of existence talk, based on his semantics for metafictive discourse, what he calls ordinary discourse about fiction, that is also a philosophical fictionalist account of existence talk. All right, I'm running over a little bit here. Try to move through some of this quickly, and it looks like it's getting hidden. Maybe if I hold it with my finger. All right, so in the literature on fictionalism, there are a couple other distinctions. They're sort of orthogonal to this distinction that Brad and I are making between philosophical fictionalism and comparative fictionalism. And if we look at philosophical fictionalism, it actually fits with either side of these various distinctions. So one of the main distinctions that comes up, a good sort of survey of this distinction is in a 2013 article by Emily Caddick-Bourne. Prefix fictionalism versus pretense-based fictionalism. And that goes back to the difference between the way Lewis explains fictional discourse and the way Walton explains fictional discourse. A prefix account uses story prefixes. Rosen does this in his account of modal discourse. Field, when he comes around to fictionalism, does it sort of in his account of mathematical discourse, right, according to standard mathematics or according to the math story, 2 + 2 = 4. Here's an issue, though. Story prefixes generate reflexive fictionalist accounts. You put a story prefix in front of a claim, and now the claim is only about the content and consequences of the cited fiction. It can't be about anything else. So this will work for accounts of fictional discourse, right? To say, well, the claim really just ends up being about the story that the sentence is from, or the story that you're talking about. Sure, that makes perfect sense. But now it's implausible if you want to talk about other sorts of discourses. If I'm giving you a prefix fictionalism, say about morality, moral discourse, then basically what I'm saying is, according to the morality fiction, murder is wrong. But then sort of like, well, who cares? If it's the morality fiction, right? I mean, according to the schmorality fiction, murder is perfectly fine. So you've got your story, here's this other story, right? So it becomes problematic because it's really restrictive in how it does the content redirection. Prefix accounts typically also generate error theoretic accounts, a face value reading. These claims are false. If we don't give them a fictionalist reading, we have to understand them as false. And that can seem problematic. Pretense-based accounts appeal to games of make-believe, a la Walton. Make-believe, the way Walton explains it, involves props, which are items that you're going to make explicit pretenses about. And then there will be, so there's stipulated pretense about the props you're using in your game, and principles of generation that link how things are with the props to conditions outside of the world. Simple example, if a couple kids are playing a Star Trek make-believe game and they're or I don't know, maybe it probably more be Star Wars, and they've got flashlights, and they want to think of their flashlights as lightsabers, right? I mean, it's a foggy night or whatever, and they get a beam in it, so they're like having a lightsaber battle in the pretense. It's to be pretended that Johnny drops his lightsaber if really Johnny drops his flashlight. So real world conditions outside the game prescribe what is to be pretended within the game in a systematic sort of way. That's what principles of generation do. When you use this sort of explanation of the semantic mechanisms involved in some discourse, games of make-believe and props and so forth, that's going to generate what we call pretense-involving fictionalist accounts, or PIF accounts. And we specifically endorse doing this, thinking that the pretenses are semantic pretenses, not pragmatic. Fred Kroon develops pretense-based accounts, but he puts the pretenses in the pragmatics of the discourse. That creates a certain kind of problem that I'll get to in just a minute. It's better to put it in the semantics. That gives you a way to avoid the problem. So it's more flexible on redirection of the content, because redirection of the content is a matter of the principles of generation of the make-believe, which can link a claim and the pretenses that are involved in it with whatever conditions you want. It doesn't have to redirect it back to the content of the make-believe. It redirects it outside of the make-believe to something that the rules stipulate it's connected to. So it's much more flexible in terms of redirecting content onto something else. It's not just content-directed fiction, it's world-directed fiction. So utterances invoking pretense, as a result of this, can still make genuinely true claims. They just do so indirectly via the pretense. You make a claim, right? And you're putting forward the pretenses involve the claim as appropriate, as to be pretended. According to the game, they are to be pretended only under certain real world conditions. So by putting them forward as to be pretended, you are more or less claiming that those real world conditions, the ones necessary for its appropriateness, that they hold. So it's a way of saying certain real world conditions hold indirectly. And if they do hold, then your claim is true. There's also this distinction that got drawn originally by Jason Stanley between what's called revolutionary fictionalism and hermeneutic fictionalism. And revolutionary accounts are proposals about how we should come to understand a discourse that we're giving a fictionalist analysis to. So this is a prescriptive and revisionary approach. Somebody might look at, say, Mackey's error theory of moral discourse and say, well, here's the problem though. I mean, I take this to be the right kind of analysis, and so moral claims are all false. I don't think we currently treat moral claims fictionally, but we should, because then, even though they're all false on a face value reading, there's a fiction involving redirection, and they're really saying something else rather than what they look like they're saying. And so, we should come to understand this fictionally, or we should come to understand mathematics fictionally. Field is a revolutionary fictionalist about mathematics. He doesn't think the standard interpretation of mathematics is fictional. He just thinks it should be, because he doesn't think there are numbers. The other side of this distinction is hermeneutic fictionalism. And these views, these sorts of accounts, claim to reveal how fiction is already at work in some discourse. So it's giving what it thinks of as a descriptive account of what's already going on. The main issue that comes up here, and Jason Stanley was the one who pushed this originally, is what's called the engagement complaint. If this discourse already involves fiction or pretense, then why don't the speakers of this discourse think about it that way? Why aren't the speakers engaged in pretense, or at least aware of pretense? So how could there be pretense already at work if the speakers don't recognize it? And so that becomes a problem if you want to give a hermeneutic account. Now, hermeneutic accounts are what Brad and I give of all the sorts of discourse that we analyze. So the engagement complaint is something that comes up for us. I could talk about that probably more in Q&A about how we try to deal with that, because what I want to end with is a kind of, can I get this to go over enough? Yeah, so here is an application of specifically semantic pretense involving fictionalism, right? Or as we like to acronymize it, our SPIF account of existence talk. And the nice thing about this account is that it resolves the problem of negative existentials, right? How can we explain how a claim like Santa Claus does not exist? How can that be true, right? Because if he doesn't exist, then the name doesn't pick anything out. But then if the name doesn't pick anything out, it's not contributing anything to the semantic value of the sentence. So the sentence should be either, gap if you're Frege, or false, maybe if you're Russell. But how could it be true? Because we think that is true. So our claim is that existence talk, this is modeled on Walton's account, but it employs a specific kind of template for developing SPIF accounts that we developed. All of our SPIF accounts have this sort of format. We start with stipulated pretense about the props of some game of make-believe. Now, this isn't a game of make-believe that anyone is actively playing. That's not what we're saying. But the idea is there's a possible game of make-believe that has certain linguistic expressions as its props, right? And so how they're going to get used, it involves a game of make-believe. And for existence talk, the specific props are names or designation expressions, and that can include demonstratives and definite descriptions. The word exists and its cognates like is, has being, subsists, any of that stuff. And the following pretenses are prescribed, explicitly stipulated about these props in this game. Every name or designation expression has a bearer, right? There are no empty names. Exists is pretended to be a genuinely descriptive predicate that's used to describe objects as having or lacking some property, the property of existence. It's a discriminating property, right? Some things have it, some things don't have it. There are things that don't have the property of existence, as this view would put it. Then we have principles of generation, and they're expressed in terms of a kind of substitutional quantification involving names. So it's basically saying for every name n from substitution class of names, the pretense is displayed in an utterance of "n exists." So those are corner quotes, so you can substitute names in. Those pretenses displayed in an utterance of that are prescribed, right, are to be pretended if and only if, and now we're going to have some external world conditions. If and only if there is some X such that the name, as the speaker actually understands it, has what we call a singular term long arm conceptual role, because we can't use the notion of reference because we take that to be a pretense involving reference notion. It gets a pretense account as well. So we have a sort of conceptual role semantics. Certain conceptual roles are kind of name-like singular term conceptual roles that can connect a name to an object, but it's not called reference because it's not a single relation. It's like a motley collection of different sorts of relations and so on. But we still think names get connected to objects. So if there is some object where the name is connected semantically to that object, then the pretenses displayed in the utterance "n exists" are true. They're prescribed. Similarly, for "n does not exist," right, the idea is there is nothing that the name "n" is content connected to. So "n exists" and "n doesn't exist are indirect ways of using a name at the object level to make a complicated and sophisticated metalinguistic claim about the use of the name one is putting on display in the utterance. That's a pretty complicated thing to try to talk about directly, right? So, but people can talk about those metalinguistic facts by using existence talk, by talking as if there's this property, every name has a bearer, and this, that, and the other, because the pretenses displayed have appropriacy conditions that have to do with metalinguistic facts. So Santa Claus does not exist is true because there is no X such that the name Santa Claus, as used in that sentence, is content connected to X. Right? The name isn't content connected to anything. And that's why that claim is true, because that's what it's saying indirectly through the mechanisms of the pretense, where these rules of this game of make-believe are semantic mechanisms involved in existence talk. So that's an example. We do it for, I don't know, all sorts of discourses. I originally did it for truth talk and a little bit for proposition talk. We cleaned up the proposition talk and truth talk stuff that I had done, really got more exacting about existence talk and identity talk, developed it for reference talk, predicate satisfaction talk, talk of properties is probably a pretense involving discourse. Talk of facts is probably a pretense involving discourse, or worldly conditions ends up being, or states of affairs ends up being a pretense involving discourse. And it all just ends up being ways to talk about other more complicated stuff indirectly by using the mechanisms that are already available, the logical mechanisms that are already available in a language. So we don't have to we don't have to have substitutional quantification, and so on. So upshot, if you want to be a fictionalist, be a philosophical fictionalist, not a comparative fictionalist. Remember, fictionalism is about language, not metaphysics or epistemology. And if you want to be a philosophical fictionalist, you're better off being a pretense involving fictionalist than a prefix fictionalist. Although most people who talk about fictionalism just kind of take prefix fictionalism to be the only game in town. Pretense-based fictionalism avoids various problems, and specifically semantic pretense involving fictionalism is the best way to pursue fictionalist approaches. And I will leave it there.
Okay, let's give Professor Woodbridge a round of applause. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. I'll call on people as I see them. Raise your hand if you have a question, or you can write question in the chat. That works too. Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for a wonderful presentation. I've been thinking a lot about mathematical fictionalism, and so this was a lot of fun. And that's actually what my question is about, because this is, I mean, I'm trying to get my bearings here a little bit, as you know, I've been, you know, this is not my direct area of expertise, but I'm curious, just to take a sentence, like when I think about mathematical fictionalism, which I had taken to be something of an ontological claim, but it sounds like you want to avoid that. It's more of a claim about language, like a statement like 2 + 2 = 4. What would your account on a fictionalist account? What do you think is the right way to understand what's going on there?
Well, so I haven't done a lot of work in fictionalism about mathematics. I would say that the two approaches, or the two developments of this that I would suggest looking at, are fields, where he thinks a prefix account works just fine according to standard mathematics, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But I think a better account is Stephen Yablow's, which he develops in an article called the Myth of the Seven, right? It's a riff on Sellers' The Myth of the Given. And that's in that 2005 Calderon anthology called Fictionalism and Metaphysics. And Yablo has a kind of pretense-based account. He's using Waltonian machinery, and he thinks that claims that look like they're about numbers, so numeral involving claims, actually end up being indirect ways of expressing complex quantificational claims. And so really it's a kind of quantificational claim, and it probably, if I'm remembering rightly, has to do with mappings, right? So if you want to say there are two of something, it's something about mapping on, like a one-to-one mapping onto other two-membered sets or something like that. So for Yablo, mathematical claims are about, or what they're about logical facts, more or less. So it's a kind of I think of it as like a logicism via fictionalism. It's not a direct logicism. He's not giving a direct reduction of mathematical discourse to logical discourse, but he's saying, if you think of it as pretense involving, because of the flexibility of a pretense account, you can have all of the numeral involving claims map onto quantificational involving claims. And so it really just is logic. That's all you're doing. You're expressing logical facts when you make true mathematical claims.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Drew.
Hi, thanks for this. I think this question might not be totally well formed yet, but I'll kind of throw this out there and see, what you think about this. Really, I suppose this is about how do we, individuate domains, and how can domains of discourse change? And so I guess I can phrase the question as, what would it take for a discourse that's not fictionalist to become fictionalist? Presumably it would have to come to meet the four conditions that you spelled out, and to kind of like give a, go ahead.
So your account of it would have to meet those, right? The discourse isn't,
I see. Okay.
What you're saying. So it's not discourses that are fictionalist, it's accounts of discourses that are, you're giving a fictionalist analysis of a discourse. So what you would have to do is say that, I don't know about what was going on with this discourse before, but now it's got these problems, like take these sentences at face value and they're semantically infelicitous, right? That's usually the starting point. There's an ontological problem. this discourse appears to be about something that we just don't think exists. So somebody might say, they might want to keep, so here's a potential, an alternative timeline, right? Stephen Stitch writes, talk about belief. People draw the conclusion, wow, I guess there aren't really beliefs. So what's going on with this discourse? Well, I guess it's not really about anything. So it's just garbage. But, you know, it seems to be a cool and useful discourse. But now that we understand that it's semantically infelicitous the way we used to try to interpret it, we were making a mistake. Let's now understand that there's something else going on here. And we either proposing, let's now treat this as fictionalism, or somebody else might say, you know what, here's the thing. There always was an element of fiction at work in the semantics of this discourse. We just didn't recognize it before. But now we've learned a little bit more. We're understanding, you know, what's going on with cognitive psychology and the mind and so on. And now we could see it. But this discourse always was kind of useful, and we could like make predictions with it and explanations. And how can we account for that? Well, maybe if it wasn't really about beliefs, but was really about something else all along, but we didn't know that, understand it that way. So you could either be revolutionary about it on discovering, or on decide, like agreeing that, oh, the discourse turns out on a face value reading is a problem. Suddenly you're, you might say, we better start treating this fictionally now because we want to save it. I don't, you know, there might be discourses that are like that, or more like, hey, we should recognize that fiction was always in the mix here. That's why it worked, even though now we realize that on a face value reading, it's garbage.
Okay, good. That's really helpful. If I could, I think that might help me clarify what I was hoping to ask.
Okay.
So on this kind of more hermeneutical approach, what would it take to say that a fictionalist account can become appropriate for discourse where it wasn't before, due to changes within the discourse?
Yeah, so typically there would be some kind of metaphysical, right, ontological motivation, or perhaps a kind of epistemological observation. So somebody could say, holy shit, von Frossen's right about claims about unobservables, right? We just like, they're not believed. They don't make claims we can know. So let's do this. Let's take this to involve fiction, right? And if your hermeneutic is saying, well, you know, it always involved fiction, and that's the sort of extra step that von Frossen's missing here. He needs to go that additional step and say, like, on a face value reading, you know, we don't care whether these are true or false, blah, blah, blah. But what they're really saying and the real content they give us, that's why we can then use these claims to make predictions and so forth. And, you know, we can accommodate all the sorts of, you know, claims that scientific realists make about science. We can accommodate it by saying, no, talk about unobservables. We don't believe it on a face value reading, but we do believe what it says indirectly. And it is true what it says indirectly when it, you know, so we can make that sort of claim. It probably works better with something like the Stitch talk about belief example, right? That's one where we'd say, well, now we've discovered metaphysically that we just don't think there are these things. And so that can't be what belief talk was ever about, because belief talk worked for something, right? So it couldn't have been about those things because they don't exist. And then there'd be no explanation for why it worked. So now that we've made this ontological discovery, now we're going to come to recognize, oh, change our account of the discourse and give a hermeneutic fictionalist account.
Okay, Gibran.
Thank you for the talk, Prof. I guess the distinction that you're trying to make is clear, that fictionalism is about the discourse, but it's not about the metaphysics. But so far what I have read is like anybody who is giving some kind of fictionalist account has some kind of metaphysics, like, presupposed. For example, Mark Gallagher, I mean, if he's giving a fictionalist account of
I don't
mathematics, he would say, well,
Gallagher's fictionalism is really fictionalism. He's doing weird stuff.
Okay, yeah, that's fine, but that wouldn't make any difference to what I'm asking, because my question is just that they would either be anti-realist or non-factualist or some version of that, right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me like, in some way, if you're giving a fictionalist account, though you're talking about the discourse of certain entities, but your metaphysical commitments are going to be something like that. You are taking an anti-realist view of those entities, or you're taking a non-factualist view of those entities.
So when I was pointing out that fictionalism is often motivated by the sort of thing you're saying, right? You've got some sort of metaphysical stance. You actually have metaphysical commitments on this. That's often the case. And so when you read people's fictionalist accounts, like, that's what's driving them. They've come to think, oh, well, there can't be these sorts of things, right? So when I was developing fictionalism about proposition talk, right, part of it was running Benacerraf style arguments and saying, well, there can't be these things, right? They just, yeah, I have a stance on propositions. But here's the thing. In particular, a pretense involving account of proposition talk, it's actually agnostic as to whether there are such things. Because what the account is more or less saying is, even if there are such things, that's not what we're talking about. So when I say Joe believes that birds are dinosaurs, because Joe does believe that, I've asked him. Right? Joe believes that birds are dinosaurs, right? It looks like I'm attributing this belief relation, and so that it involves fiction of there being a proposition and Joe being related to it and so on. But what I'm really talking about, the way the rules for the game work, is it's redirected to me saying something more like this. Joe has in his cognitive system some kind of cognitive state that has a long arm conceptual role that's very similar to the long arm conceptual role that I'm going to put on display now. Birds are dinosaurs. And that's like really complicated stuff to think about, to lay out, to describe, to characterize, to get people to understand. You're putting a long arm conceptual role on display and pointing at it, and then pointing at Joe's head and saying, in there is some state that's got something like this that I'm indicating somehow. Super massively complicated. But instead of all of that, I could just say, Joe believes that birds are dinosaurs. Now, if it turns out that there are these Platonic type entities of either, Phrygian type thoughts or Russellian type thoughts, or even possible sets of possible worlds, it's like, it doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about. So it's agnostic rather than requiring that there aren't propositions, but it is typically motivated by the kind of ontological stance you're talking about, rejection. That's what brings people to fictionalism, but it's not required.
Okay, so that's very clear and very interesting. So I'm wondering, why can we just not say that then fictionalist accounts are just metaphysical accounts, and not make the distinction that you're trying to make?
because they're accounts of discourse, right? I mean, when I tell you, I'm going to tell you how this claim, Joe believes that birds are dinosaurs, works as a claim, right? And it's got, you know, it involves this mechanism, and content gets redirected to this complicated claim about a long arm conceptual role of his cognitive state. And it allows me to put a long arm conceptual role on display in my utterance and all that. It's an analysis of discourse, right? That's what I'm doing there. Now, and then also, it just doesn't care about the metaphysics to some degree, right? Maybe there are these weird abstract proposition things. Who cares? I just gave you an analysis of the discourse according to which, even if there are those things, we're not talking about them.
Okay, so the fictionalist account of, let's say, numbers wouldn't be necessarily a commitment to ontology of numbers.
I mean, it's not a fictionalist account of numbers. It's a fictionalist account of number talk, right? Because it's always an account of discourse. It's not an account of entities. Fictionalism doesn't classify entities as being somehow. It doesn't take a class of entities and say, these ones are fictional. These ones are non-fictional or real. It's not doing that.
Okay, correct. So I understand now better. So what would you say is the ontological status of the ontological discourse that you're producing, or the ontological status of the fictional account of the discourse?
The ontological status of my account?
Of the fictional account of the discourse.
So you want to know, in a sense, what you want to know is what the ontological status of a theory is.
So you're producing
theories in general. What is a theory ontologically? That's what you're asking me?
Yeah, so let's say you give a fictionalist account of numbers, right? And you're saying, well, fictionalist account of numbers is just number talk. It's about the discourse of numbers.
Yep.
And I'm asking, okay, if that's not a metaphysical commitment, then what's the ontological status of that account that you're giving?
So you're not asking me what I think the ontological status is regarding numbers.
No, not that.
But of the account.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Would you go fictionalist about it, or would you say there's something ontologically absolute about it?
Well, I personally get squeamish about abstract objects in general. So I don't like the idea that there's going to be some sort of abstract object thing that is my theory. I don't tend to think of theories that way. What there is a bunch of my utterances and my writings, and there's the the semantics of those. When I'm saying I'm giving a fictionalist account of some discourse, I mean that. I'm not there's no pretense involved in me saying I'm pretending to give a fictionalist account. No, I'm giving a fictionalist account. And I think giving an account is engaging in language use. And so there's a bunch of language use that I've engaged in. That's whatever the ontological status of my actual utterances, that's the ontological status of the account.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Joe, and then we'll end on Joe's. We're about out of time.
This will likely be very fast because I think it actually is a follow-on from Gibran's point, and I'm just going to ask it from a slightly different direction. And that's on the motivation. I think that the very last bit of what you just said there, James, is important, because if the motivation itself is metaphysical and you're giving some sort of a semantic-based pretense involving account, the SPIF account, I worry that the account itself isn't going to satisfy that motivation in some way, and so in which case you're not going to, be able to satisfy any kind of motivation you had for it. But what you said at the very end made me think a little bit differently about this, and so let me make sure I caught this correctly. And that is, look, I'm just not interested in abstract entities. And so because of that kind of deflated, non-realist, whatever you want to call it, sense, I'm now going to give you a semantic account to satisfy that motivation. Is that the metaphysical motivation that you're speaking of, or if I misunderstood it?
That probably sort of is. Sometimes I like to describe the situation in the following sort of way. A lot of times when you're doing philosophical theorizing, you reach what I like to call a choice point, where the choice is between, I mean, the choice is something has to get weird. And so you can either make the metaphysics weird, or you can think our language in talking about this is weirder. Something is weirder than we thought. So a classic case of a choice point that goes the wrong way, in my view, is Meinong, right? It's like, you know, negative existentials. Like, oh, wow, we didn't recognize it. There's a problem. What do we do? I know, all names really do have bearers, right? It's just that existence only applies to some and doesn't apply to others, but they all have being. So there are levels of being and like this, that, the other. And then Russell comes in with, okay, so you're telling me the round square there has being. I'm not eating lunch with you anymore, Alexis, right? So, right. So you hit a choice point, and, Meinong went, metaphysics is going to get weird. That's how I'm going to deal with the problem of negative existentials. Russell is like, no. The language gets weird. That's why we got to analyze names descriptively in terms of definite descriptions, and it's actually quantification, and all the names go away, and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, so the language gets weird, right? And I am almost always the language gets weird kind of thing, because the idea that we, as the moderately intelligent apes that wear clothes that we are, can somehow create a language that tracks the ultimate structure of reality, like it's just tracked in our grammar. That's absurd to me, right? I mean, it's like, what do? We come up with ways of talking about things. And sometimes it's convenient to use linguistic devices already available in a language to talk about ordinary dry goods, medium-sized dry goods, right? Let's use that sort of language to talk about really weird things like metalinguistic facts regarding kinds of uses of names. That's a really weird kind of fact to talk about. It's super complicated, but I can do it by just using the name, putting the kind of use I want to talk about on display, basically pointing at it by using it in this way with exists or doesn't exist. And suddenly I've made this complicated metalinguistic claim because the language is more complicated than we thought. And that's where it gets complicated. And the best way to actually do it is with a fictionalist account, because then you don't have to take it as sort of like, well, it's a brute fact that this predicate, it's a predicate. So it seems like it's operating like every other predicate, but it's a brute fact that really all it's doing is expressing quantification. Really? No explanation for that. Just like it's a brute fact. Here's an explanation. It actually involves pretense.
Cool, thanks, James.
Okay, I think I'm going to let Klaus chime in and then we'll be done. He's the one that tracked down our speaker for us. So, oh, you're on mute, Klaus.
You're on mute, Klaus. You're still on mute. You're on mute. Muted.
No, I'm not in mood anymore.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm sorry. This was a great talk. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I only have a quick question about distinguishing the era theoretic fictionalism from. So according to which all talk about fictions is false.
That's no, that's not what it is. The era theoretic fictionalist account says all of the claims in this discourse that this discourse that I'm theorizing about, all of those claims are false.
Are literally false, right?
Well, I mean, the most sort of broadest naive version of it is just they're all false.
Yeah.
Period.
And so you want to say that they are semantically infelicitous?
On a face value reading.
On a face value reading. Okay,
Yeah.
so would you be so kind to explore or to explain the difference a little bit more to me between, if I say Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, right? That's true, right?
Yes.
But then I'm talking about the fictional character. And so, that's, and so on. And
Well, so if you're a fictional realist, right, you don't think that's true. I do think that's true. I don't think Sherlock Holmes exists. I don't think there are fictional characters.
okay.
There's
Yeah, me
talk-
too. I don't think.
There's talk seemingly about fictional characters, but
Mhm.
here's the thing. If I say something like Sherlock Holmes was created by Arthur Conan
But if I
Doyle,
say Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, I'm saying something true. And then I'm
Yes.
saying something about the fictional characters. So
Actually,
according
no,
to
no,
the
no.
era,
No, wait. You're saying something about the name Sherlock Holmes as it was.
no, I'm saying something about Sherlock.
Actually, you're not.
Okay. Yeah, because he doesn't exist.
Right.
That's
There is
right.
no one for you to talk about.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So it looks like you're saying something about Sherlock Holmes,
Mhm.
but you're not. You're actually saying something about the name as it's being used in that very sentence.
I
That
haven't been saying anything about the name. I mean,
you are
I just
indirectly
said Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. So
ends up being a claim about the kind of use of the name you are making in that very claim.
but that presupposes some analysis of the statement, right? So you're saying actually I'm making a claim about the name of Sherlock Holmes. So that it's empty or something. It doesn't, its name, I mean, it's empty. It doesn't, yeah, okay.
But
So I am not talking about Sherlock Holmes, but about the name of Sherlock Holmes.
I mean, about's a tricky word, right? It's like, there's a sense in which you're within the pretense you're talking about Sherlock Holmes, because in the pretense, the
Sure.
name does have a bearer. But
Sure.
but what the serious content of your claim, what you're really saying about the world, is that this name, as you're using it, is empty.
Is empty, so I'm saying something that is false, literal.
Well, you're saying something that's true because you're saying Sherlock Holmes does not exist, which is
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'm saying literally something that is true, but it's still semantically infelicitous.
on a face value reading.
Okay. All right.
But it's not semantically infelicitous when we dig into it and see what it's really saying about the world outside of the pretense via the mechanisms that the pretense brings in.
Okay. All right.
So that's how it can end up being a true claim, even though the name doesn't refer to anything.
Okay.
But at the same time, it isn't just kind of automatically, it's not sort of directly metalinguistic, right? Because you're using the name. So a use of a name isn't directly about itself. So the pretense gives a routing for the claim to end up being about the very use you're making, because it's really implausible to say this, the way the name works in this context is to be about itself. Whereas if I use names in other contexts, they're not about themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So are you suggesting that we should use these pretense claims always as prefixed with according to the game?
No.
That is to be pretended that P, now we are playing the arithmetic game, or we are playing the
prefix views are problematic. Even if you try to turn a pretense view into a prefix view, that's not the way to do it. I mean, I did point out that Walton and Lewis, when they're analyzing fiction, end up in the same place. The claim, Harry Potter's an only child, turns out to be about the Harry Potter stories for both of them. But for Lewis, it's about the Harry Potter stories directly. For Walton, it's about the Harry Potter stories via a more circuitous, complex route.
Yeah.
That doesn't always land you back on the story. But when you use a prefix, the only thing you're talking about is the content of the story. And that's too restrictive.
Okay, we better.
I am not understanding everything of this, but thank you very much for your answer. We can talk about it. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, let's say thank you one more time, all.
Thank you.
Thanks for
All right.
coming. Thanks for your questions.
I want to remind you that we've got a kind of social thing tonight, and it's at 8 p.m. Mountain Time, and the link for that is in the chat here.
Thanks a lot.
Let me add, Rachel, I've also sent everybody an email with that link. So if
Oh yeah, so you don't have to desperately try to grab it before we close down.
I would like to grab the opportunity and to thank Richard for doing all of this. Thank you.
Thanks for all your work.
Thanks, Klaus. Yeah, everyone's been great and helpful. So it's wonderful. Yeah, about an hour and 10 minutes. Hope to see you all there.
Okay, see ya.
See you later.